And we're back, and better than ever. This is going to be part 2 of the lecture on bone tissue. By now, we've gone in detail. We've gone over the structure of the long bone. And I went over it several times in the first video because it's really important that you get all those structures down, okay? So in this video, which is the second half, now that we know the structure of the bone, now we can begin to fill in some of the other pieces. So before we talk about some of the function, there's some other things to consider. So we talked about the structure of the bone, right? And actually, as I'm talking about this, I realized that I didn't yet talk about the epiphyseal line, but we're going to come back to that. So we're okay. All right. So we talked about the structure of the bone, the diaphysis, the epiphysis, the spongy bone, the compact bone, the osteon, all those things. Well, it turns out that, of course, there's some other stuff in the bone. So we're going to talk about the bone cells, which are going to be right here. So we are going to talk about those. And in terms of some of the inorganic stuff, you don't have to know all of the stuff here on the right side of the screen. Just know that we have a lot of calcium and other minerals in there. So really, if we can just summarize it, there's calcium and other minerals in the bone also. And they actually make up a considerable amount of that bone. So if we were to take bone tissue by mass, about 2/3 of that bone mass is these minerals, okay? Now, you don't have to know hydroxyapatites or any of that, but just know that in amongst all the other structures that we already talked about, we do have calcium and some other minerals that are quite substantial. Let's talk about the bones. So we've already mentioned the osteocytes. These are the mature bone cells. I've got pictures here on the right, just so you can see. So you can see part C here is an osteocyte. I'm not going to ask you to identify the picture, but I just have them here so you can see the different types of bone cells do indeed look different. Okay, but the mature bone cells, we know that they're squunched in between the rings of collagen called lamellae. These mature bone cells sit in cavities called lacunae, all those good things. Then we're going to talk about osteoblasts and osteoclasts. We're going to focus on these. So here we talked about some of the blast versus clast. And this is going to be true for all cells. In this case, it's an osteoblast because we're talking about bone. We could also refer to a cell as a myoblast, which would refer to muscle. Anytime you see a B blast, this is a type of cell that builds. So when we put the two together, osteoblast, this is a kind of cell that builds bone. So it lays down bone tissue. It looks like this. Again, you don't need to know the structure. I just have a picture there for you. But an osteoblast is what actually lays down new bone. It builds bone. It is also important to note that the osteoblasts mature into osteocytes. So these are what are going to mature into the fully mature bone cell. And it does say that up here as well. On the other hand, anytime you see a C for clast, this is a type of cell that breaks down. So in the case of an osteoclast, it's a type of cell that breaks down bone. And again, we can see a variety of prefixes to identify different types of cells that break down. A myoclast breaks down muscle. An osteoclast breaks down bone. But here we see two cells, osteoblast, osteoclast, and there is only one letter difference in the names. So sometimes people think, oh, Dr. Jenkins, she's so mean because she cares about spelling. Well, this is why. Here's a case where one letter change in the spelling changes the whole meaning of the word and the whole type of cell. So an osteoblast builds bone tissue, lays down new bone, and an osteoclast breaks down bone. It is interesting to note that an osteoclast, it kind of resembles a white blood cell. So the osteoclasts are kind of in their own category in terms of structure. The osteoclasts do not go on to becoming osteocytes, but they're in their own little class, and they break down bone tissue. It is also interesting to note that these cells are located in different parts of the bone. The only location that you need to know is the one that we've already talked about, which is where the osteocytes. We know the osteocytes are in the lacunae, the little cavities in the compact bone. Well, just notice that the osteoblasts are in a different place. You don't need to know where, but if you're interested, the osteoblast is located more along the periosteum. The osteoclast is located more towards the inside, right? More towards the medullary cavity. So they're located in different places based on what their function is. But the only one you need to know is that the osteocyte, as we've already talked about, is in the compact bone. All right. Remember, if I skip something, you don't need to know it. All right. So one of the physiology pieces to discuss would be, how does our body form bone in the first place? And in terms of forming bone, there is only two ways to do it. One way that our body can form bone is through something called intramembranous ossification. Another way that we can form bone tissue is through something called endochondral ossification. So we're going to talk a little bit about both of these. For intramembranous ossification. Now, first, if we look at the word ossification, ossify means to harden. So it makes sense that if we're talking about some form of ossification, we're talking about the formation of bone, which is hard. Now, intramembranous ossification is how we form bone only in the flat bones of the skull and the clavicle. That's it. Every other type of bone is going to be formed through the second means, endochondral. But intramembranous is the way that we form bone only in the bones of the skull. You can see in this picture the frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, and the clavicle. In terms of the more specifics of how this type of bone development works, we're not going to get that specific. All we're going to say is that bone forms, what does it say here? Yeah, from a fibrous membrane. All we're going to say here is that this type of bone growth involves formation of bone through a fibrous membrane. Keep it simple. You've heard of that, right? The KISS principle, keep it simple. And remember, this is the way that bone grows for only the bones of the flat bones of the skull and the clavicle. All right. We're going to spend much more time talking about endochondral ossification because this is how every other bone in our body develops. So every other bone, except the flat bones of the skull and the clavicle, forms through something called endochondral ossification. Now, if we break the word down, chondro means cartilage. So this gives us a clue. Endochondral ossification is the formation of bone from a cartilage model. And I'll write that down that way. Formation of bone from a cartilage model. Cartilage. So it's different from intramembranous ossification. Here, we literally form a cartilage version of the bone that over time eventually is replaced by bone. It's actually pretty darn cool. Granted, I think a lot of things are cool that many people don't, but that's okay. We are going to talk about the steps of endochondral ossification, but before I do that, let's just look at the basics. We can see at the very beginning, we have a shape of a bone, but it is all cartilage. When you see this blue color, it means that it's all cartilage. So when we're beginning to form the body, and this begins in utero, right? If you go back, here's a picture of the skeleton of a fetus, right? Initially, all these bones are made up of cartilage. They're bendy. And that's by design. So we get the idea of the shape of the bone that it's going to become. But this person is still growing. They've just begun. So it wouldn't make sense to harden these into bone right away. It would make them much more difficult to grow. So we form these shapes of what the bone's going to become out of cartilage. And then over time, as we grow up, as we go through puberty, we eventually begin to replace that blue cartilage in this picture with bone. And eventually what we're left with is an entire structure of bone with only a little bit of cartilage remaining around the ends. I think that makes sense. Endochondral ossification. We form bone through a cartilage model. So we start with the shape of the bone, but it's all cartilage, and over time, it is replaced by bone. All right. I'd like you to have an idea about these steps. So if we were to talk about it, we would say, initially, the bone shape is all cartilage. Okay? And let me see. Yeah. So you can read here more about it, and there's something that's happening with the formatting, so I'm sorry that some of the labels are a little off. But that's okay, because we're going to go over the basics anyway. But what's going to happen is that over time, we're going to start to lay down bone. And we do that, let me just draw a line through here. We do that by forming a primary ossification center. Primary ossification center. And it's shown in the picture. So if we look here, right in the inside, that is what the primary ossification center is. And it forms in the middle. You should know that. It forms in the center of the bone. Because what we're going to find is that the bone grows from the center out towards the ends. Really important. What we're going to see is that the bone forms over the cartilage. The bone overtakes the cartilage, starting in the center at a primary ossification center, moving out towards the ends. Cool. And as this process continues, we're going to get our own blood supply. So this picture is showing you the introduction of a blood supply, and that's just going to help the process of laying down bone over the cartilage, or that bone hardening. It's going to help it happen even faster because we're bringing in the nutrients and the supplies that we need. Now, as time goes on, eventually we're going to form a secondary ossification center. It's already written here, so I'm just going to circle it. A secondary ossification center forms. And this time, the secondary ossification center forms in the epiphyses. The primary ossification center was formed in the center. But now we have a secondary ossification center in each of the epiphyses. So what's happening is we're laying down bone tissue from the center out, from the primary ossification center, and then we begin to form bone from the secondary ossification center in. And what happens is the last place where bone growth happens is right here in what's called the epiphyseal line or the growth plate. Growth plate or epiphyseal line, which we're going to talk about in a minute. All right? So what's happening here is that secondary ossification centers form in the epiphysis, and they're going to start to lay down bone over the cartilage from the ends in. Eventually, bone is going to be laid down from the center towards the end and from the ends towards the center. And eventually, the entire thing is all bone. I mean, except for the little edge of cartilage that we talked about. But eventually, we have ossified the whole thing. And of course, this is going to happen, or I should say, this is going to be finalized at the end of puberty. So at the end of puberty, for women, maybe somewhere between 16 and 18. I really can't spell. For men, somewhere between 18 and 20, maybe. But of course, it is at the end of puberty that we no longer grow taller. You're done, right? And that's because we've replaced all the cartilage with bone. And because of the direction that this endochondral ossification occurs, from the center towards the ends, and later from the ends towards the center, the last place to lay down bone is here. The growth plate or epiphyseal line, the last place to lay down bone. Really cool. Okay. Couple odds and ends here. So I already talked about this. The growth of bones occurs from the center to the ends, and then eventually from the ends to the center. The epiphyseal plates close, or the growth plate closes, at the end of puberty. Got myself a little excited there. So the bone growth in terms of length is going to continue to occur until puberty ends. And when puberty ends, those growth plates, or the epiphyseal lines, at the end of puberty, these are quote unquote closed. There's no more growth happening. I do want to make a point. At the end of puberty, we no longer see any growth in the length of bones. But even past puberty, we can see a difference or a growth in the diameter of bones. That happens to be called appositional growth. You don't need to know that term, but you should be aware of the concept that the bones will continue to grow in length until puberty ends, and then you will no longer continue to grow bones in length, but our bones can get wider or narrower in diameter even after puberty. Okay, now I'm going to go back because I want to go back to the epiphyseal line in our discussion of the anatomy. I think it makes more sense now that we've talked about how bone grows. So remember, bone grows from the center towards the ends, and then bone's going to grow from the ends towards the center. And the last place, the place where they meet, is typically somewhere near the junction between the epiphysis and diaphysis. And that junction between the epiphysis and diaphysis, where bone growth happens last, is called the epiphyseal line, or the growth plate. I love this picture. We have two x-rays, and in the left, we see an x-ray of an adolescent. So the growth plates are open. If we look at, this is the radius, right? So here we have the epiphysis of the radius, and then we have the diaphysis of the radius. And what do we notice? There's literally a space between them. And when you see that open space, it means that the growth plates are open. There's still room for bone growth in length. However, once we have Once we've reached full puberty, those growth plates will close and there's no longer an open space. What you'll typically see as a remnant is a little bit of a solid line. And I'm going to put this line here now. And then I'm going to take it away. And you should be able to see a little bit of a thicker white line going across there. It's just a remnant of the growth plate. Now this has a couple of applications. Because children have bones that are still cartilage, maybe, we've replaced some of the cartilage with bone, but as a 2-year-old especially, the bones are mostly cartilage, and that means that they're bendy. So, have you ever seen like a little kid fall and you wonder, oh my God, how did they not break a bone? Well, it's because their bones are mostly cartilage and they're bendy, so they're more able to withstand some of that stress. If we look at certain types of fractures in adolescence, now we're thinking maybe it's more common in 10, 12-year-olds. They're more likely to fracture a bone at the epiphyseal line. So a lot of fractures happen here as the bones are growing because that is where the bone is at its weakest. Just extra information for you fine folks. All right, really cool. So we talked about the 2 ways that bone grows. Excellent. Okay. Now, even after we finish puberty, there's still a process of bone remodeling, which means that we are constantly laying down new bone and we're constantly breaking down old bone. So even after puberty, we're constantly breaking down old bone and at the same time constantly replacing that with new bone. And this is true everywhere in the body. We talked about, in the integumentary system, we talked about how the cells in the epidermis start in the basal layer, work their way up, and eventually they're sloughed off and they fall off the top, and then we replace it with new. Well, that happens over the course of days. Over the course of a week, maybe you've broken down and replaced your entire epidermis. However, for bones, the process takes a little bit longer. This is not going to be on your test, but I think I mentioned this before. Most textbooks will say somewhere around every 7 years, we've broken down and replaced our entire skeleton. Sometimes this can be hard for people to imagine. One way that has been helpful for me, as I'm sitting here in my house, I'm looking around and there's windows, there's the floor. So if you imagine a house, maybe 1 year, the owners replace the windows. So they take down the old windows, replace with new. Maybe the next year, they pull up the old flooring and put down new flooring. So imagine your skeleton like that. Over the course of a year, maybe we've only replaced this and that, but not the other parts of the skeleton. But over the course of 7 years, by replacing the windows 1 year and replacing the floor the next and replacing something else the next, over the course of 7 years, piece by piece, I rebuilt the whole house. Same idea with the skeleton. Now, because of our fine knowledge, we can fill in some of the gaps. Well, what type of bone cell is going to break down bone? I don't even have to ask because you know it is the osteoclast. If only I could spell, though. So we know the osteoclast break down old bone. What type of cells are going to replace it and build it with new bone? Of course, that's the osteoblast. Ideally, you want this process to be equal. So as a healthy adult, the rate of osteoclast activity should equal the rate of osteoblast activity. So for whatever bone you've broken down, you've replaced it equally. This is what the sign of healthy bone growth and remodel. Now, of course, this could change conditionally What if you fracture a bone? Well, in that area, there's going to be more osteoclast activity initially, but then it'll be followed up with more osteoblast activity. As we get into our golden years, if you think about the elderly, well, just because over time parts of the body get worn down, we're not as good at building bones. So in the elderly, our bones are more fragile. Why? Because we're really good at breaking down old bones, but we're not as good as replacing it with new. But as a healthy adult, the activity of osteoclasts and osteoblasts should be equal. And this is what this says. This is all just words for saying what I've already said. As a healthy adult and a healthy amount of bone remodeling over time, we should have an equal rate of osteoclast and osteoblast activity. All right. Let's talk for a moment about the amount of calcium in the bone. So I mentioned minerals in the bone. They're really important. We have a bunch of minerals, but probably the one that we're most familiar with and that we'll be talking about more this semester is calcium. So here's the rub. You will not be surprised because you already know this. We store the calcium in our body in our bones. You took your Flintstone vitamins when you were a kid because Flintstone vitamins, drink your milk, makes your bones strong. So we have calcium in the bone. And while that calcium is in the bone, it helps to make the bone strong. Great. But here's the other point that is less talked about. Calcium is stored in bones. So I'm going to put the word stored, because I like that word better. Because what happens is the bones store calcium, but we're constantly taking some of that calcium out of storage and putting that calcium into the bloodstream. So not all of our calcium is housed in the in the bones, right? Not all of our calcium stays in the bones. So while calcium stays in our bones to give it strength, some of that calcium leaves the bones. That's really important because calcium has so many other functions around the body. Look at all these things that calcium is needed for. So we have to keep a constant supply of calcium in the blood. Some of the calcium leaves the bones and circulates in the bloodstream. It may not be much in terms of overall volume. So indeed, most of our calcium is in the bones, but not all of it. There's a very important amount of calcium that leaves the bone and circulates in the bloodstream. And as that calcium circulates in the bloodstream, parts of our bodies can use that calcium. When our heart muscle wants to contract, what does it need? Calcium. So the heart muscle has to take calcium out of the blood to help the heart muscle contract. So what happens is any time that the blood calcium goes down, because the heart muscle is using it, let's say, anytime the blood calcium goes down a little bit, well, that means that we have to take more we have to take more calcium out of the bone to put into the blood. You don't need to know all of these, but just know the principle here. That calcium, not only is it stored in the bones where it helps to keep the bones strong, but that there's a portion of calcium that leaves the bones, goes to the bloodstream. And calcium is used all over the body for really important stuff. And because of that, we must talk about blood calcium regulation. In other words, which is blood calcium homeostasis, which we talked about on day 1 of this class. And like most things in our body, we regulate blood calcium through our good old friend, the negative feedback loop. Let's talk about it. Enter in a wonderful diagram. Don't you love diagrams? Even if you don't, I do. So, we have a steady amount of blood calcium that we need. Here's the number 9 to 11 milligrams per 100 mils of blood, but you don't need to know that number. It is just there. All you need to know is that in the blood, there's a certain amount of calcium that we need. And I want to emphasize, we're talking about blood calcium here. We're not talking about the calcium being regulated in the bone tissue. We're talking about the amount of calcium in the blood. Okay. So the example that I already gave, and let's talk about it. What happens if our blood calcium begins to drop? So we had this balance beam of normal, but we had certain parts of our body use up a lot of that calcium from the blood. And as a result, the blood calcium drops a little bit. Well, it's not an immediate emergency, because levels of our blood calcium, just like levels of our blood glucose, they're constantly going to fluctuate. But we have to have a mechanism in place to replace that blood calcium. That was a crazy sentence. So what happens if we have a drop in blood calcium? Well, there's going to be some place in the body that senses that. Remember, that's the first step of our homeostatic feedback loop. It happens to be the thyroid gland. You don't need to know that yet. In AEP2, we'll talk about it. So when blood calcium drops, we have a gland that picks up on that. And then our control center, the brain, decides we need to fix it. And what happens is we stimulate osteoclasts. So when our blood calcium drops, in order to fix it, we stimulate osteoclasts. That's what you need to know. When our blood calcium levels drop, we stimulate our osteoclasts with a C. Now let's think about that. If our blood calcium drops, there's not enough calcium in the blood. So it's going to make sense to stimulate the osteoclasts. Because what do the osteoclasts do? They break down bone. And how it works is the osteoclasts break down bone in the bone, and as an osteoclast breaks down bone, it releases calcium into the bloodstream. Okay? So if our initial problem is that we have a drop in blood calcium, we're going to fix that. If our initial problem is not enough blood calcium, we're going to stimulate osteoclasts. They break down bone and release calcium back into the bloodstream. And if our initial problem was not enough calcium in the blood, if I have osteoclasts releasing calcium into the blood, it's going to bring blood calcium back up to normal. And then, to be honest, folks, if you just memorize one of those, then the other way is just the reverse. So you really don't need to memorize both if you can just memorize one, because what's the opposite? Well, if blood calcium goes up too much, maybe you just had a big glass of milk. Well, it's fine, but we don't need all that calcium in the blood right away. We want to actually store that calcium in the bones. So if we have an initial problem of too much blood calcium, we're going to have a gland that pays attention to that. And then what are we going to stimulate? The osteoblasts. Because when we stimulate osteoblasts, in order to build bone, the osteoblasts have to pull calcium out of the bloodstream in order to build bone. Right? The osteoblasts, in order to build bone tissue, the osteoblasts have to pull calcium out of the blood in order to build bone. So by building new bone and pulling some calcium out of the blood, the remaining blood calcium drops back down to normal. This is really important, just like homeostasis of anything. All right. Good stuff. Okay, so now we just have some odds and ends, okay? Make sure that you can define Wolff's law, and that is to say that bone will grow and or remodel based on the stress placed upon it, right? So, you know, the easiest example, even though it's horrible to talk about, would be the ancient, or maybe not as ancient as we want to think about, the ancient thing of foot binding in China, where men of power particularly thought that women that had smaller feet were more attractive, so they would shove women's kids' feet into these small shoes, and over time the bone's going to grow in response to the stress placed upon it. So the bone has no place to grow, so it kind of grows up and it just becomes this block. All right, now what happens when things go wrong? So I've listed here some examples of bone fractures. You don't have to know all of them, all right? First, I want to point out that a fracture is really the same thing as a break. So if someone says, oh, I didn't break my bone, I just fractured it, medically speaking, it's the same. It's any kind of interruption in bone tissue. But you can talk about the severity of a fracture or a break, because of course there's different severities. But just on its face, a fracture is the same thing as a break. Alrighty, I'd like you to know non-displaced versus displaced and a stress fracture. A displaced fracture would be like this, a displaced, meaning that the ends of the bones are no longer, that's not a good way to think about it. The ends of the bones are no longer aligned. Here we have one end of the bone. The other end of the bone should be here, but it's not. So a displaced fracture means that the two bone ends are no longer aligned. A non-displaced, let me redraw that. A non-displaced fracture would mean that here's my one end of the bone. Fracture. Fracture. A non-displaced would be that the bone ends are still in line with each other. So on our left here that I've drawn, non-displaced, fractured bone ends are still aligned with each other. Displaced would be that the bone ends are no longer aligned with each other. A stress fracture is difficult to see on an x-ray. So if you especially acutely think someone has a stress fracture, you would do a bone scan, which looks like this. The results look like this. And a stress fracture, would be identified by these hot spots. A stress fracture is just a tiny crack in the bone. It's so small that it's not really perceptible on an x-ray, especially at first. And it tends to occur because of repetitive stress. This top right picture did not occur because of repetitive stress. This is probably a car accident or a skiing accident, right? Because this is a femur. So in order to have that kind of displaced fracture, there had to be a lot of acute force. A stress fracture is more likely to occur in a runner who's constantly putting that stress onto their bones. And let's talk about these two. An avulsion fracture would be like a spiral fracture. An avulsion fracture would be when a piece of bone is torn off or avulsed. This is a picture of the elbow, and here we have, this appears to be the medial epicondyle of the elbow being torn off. Likely, it happens because there is a ligament running, and when that ligament gets torn, a piece of the bone is torn right along with it. So an avulsion fracture, when a piece of bone is torn off. And then a spiral fracture is just as it sounds, when the shape of the fracture is more in a spiral way. This occurs because of a twisting or torsion force. So if someone is planted, they have their foot planted on the ground, and then they turn and they kind of, like a football player, plants the right foot, starts to turn in the opposite direction and gets hit by another player, that twisting force is more likely to cause a spiral fracture. All right, one of the last big topics, it might be the last big topic in this chapter, is healing of the bone. This is different from normal regeneration. So as we already talked about, it's normal to have our osteoclasts break down old bone and have our osteoblasts replace it with new. But this would be more of an injury situation where we have an unexpected interruption of bone tissue. You should know these 4 steps, okay? If you read some textbooks or some sources, they might call these steps something different slightly, but it's the same process. And what we're going to see is that this process mimics endochondral ossification. Because really, why do we want to reinvent the wheel? If we know we can grow bone initially really well, remember we grow most of our bones through endochondral ossification, through having a cartilage model of that bone first, that over time is slowly replaced with bone. Well, if that works so well to begin with, why not redo that even after puberty when we have a fracture of the bone? And that's what happens here. So, and I'm going to draw my own little version. Of course, not well, because I never draw things well. So let's say that we have a fracture, any kind of interruption in the bone. So these bone edges were together, but then, there's a fracture. Well, the first thing that's going to happen is a hematoma forms. And that just means bleeding and swelling. That area of swelling, an area of bleeding around the localized area is called a hematoma. And why is this going to happen? Well, because you've broken blood vessels. These blood vessels used to be attached. But when you fracture the bone, you fracture all those blood vessels. Remember, we've got blood vessels going through each haversian canal of every osteon. How about that for a review? And additionally, that swelling, not only is it a result of the buildup of fluid from the blood vessels that have been broken, it also occurs because we're bringing in supplies for repair. So your body is going to be sending white blood cells to the area because now that we've broken this tissue, we're more prone to infection. So that swelling also occurs because your body is going to deliberately send things there to begin repair. And as a side benefit to all of this, when an area swells like this due to injury, it's a big old sign to you hey, you just fractured a bone in your ankle. Don't walk on it. So the swelling acts as a deterrent and acts as a way for us to be more protective. Then what happens is we begin to fill in that gap with cartilage. So step number 2 is we begin to fill in this gap with cartilage. It's not bone, it's cartilage. So we lay down this fibrous tissue and cartilage. It's kind of haphazard, right? This is a pretty early process. So really, from that initial swelling, we want to begin to bridge the gap between the injured tissue. We want to give it a little bit of sturdiness. And what forms is called a fibrocartilaginous callus. We fill that area with cartilage. And oftentimes, the area that's filled in with cartilage extends a little bit beyond the surface of the bone. So you can see it's a little bit enlarged. And that's why it gets the name callus. And then what's going to happen? Well, we had swelling. And then we laid down cartilage. But then what's going to happen? We're going to start to replace that cartilage with bone. This is exactly what happens when we produce the bones initially. We initially put down all that cartilage, but over time, that fibrocartilaginous callus is going to form a bony callus. So we're going to start to replace the cartilage with bone. What you notice about this is the initial bone that we lay down is spongy bone. So no matter where in the bone the fracture happened, we initially lay down spongy bone. And lastly, there's remodeling. So lastly, we replace that spongy bone with compact bone. Replace spongy with compact bone. And the key here is we lay down this compact bone in the line of stress. So we begin to lay down that compact bone in the line of stress. Really cool. Here's some pictures here. So initially, and I don't have a picture to show every phase, but initially we just have swelling. And you can see on x-rays, and you may know this, the swelling kind of shows up as this white cloudiness. Okay? And what's evident here is that there's a callus. So if I look carefully, I can see that some of that healing has extended a little bit further out than just the bone tissue itself. And that's just because, you know, it's like a construction site. You're laying down new bone. You got a lot of stuff and supplies. So it's absolutely normal. Okay? And then the bottom here, you know, depending on what bone is fractured or how the bone was fractured or how severe it was fractured, sometimes you need to put in reinforcing pins or rods, right? All right. The last point I want to make about this is if we think about our care of someone that's fractured a bone, whether it's just the care in an emergency room and they do an x-ray and then give them a soft cast, or whether it's rehabilitation in a physical therapist office after, you know, a fracture of a bone or an ACL reconstruction. Or it could also be in the hospital, you know, someone had open heart surgery, God forbid. Well, they had to saw through the sternum, which means they had to fracture the sternum. So in addition to the heart healing, there's going to be some bone healing. And our care and rehabilitation of these fractured bones as they repair is very much paired with what step of fracture healing we're on. If someone is in the hematoma formation, if it just happened, you don't want them to put any weight on it. Don't move it. Let it rest. As we get towards the end of the fibrocartilaginous callus formation, or even during the cartilaginous callus formation, you may have the person not put weight on that injured bone, but you may have them contract their muscles around it, even if they're lying down, and that can help to promote blood flow to bring in new cartilage. As we get to the bony callus, you may have them move that limb a little bit, because as we're laying down that spongy bone, we know that spongy bone also can lay down the line of stress, but it also means that by moving body parts around this, it improves the blood flow. And then lastly, especially in the bony remodeling, you want to have this person doing some exercises because you want that bone tissue to lay down in the line of stress. So you have to apply a little bit of stress in order for the bone tissue to be able to do that. You know, we used to think, I mean, this is kind of my area, so that's why I talk about it, sorry. You know, we used to think if someone had a fractured bone, or even 25, 30 years ago, if someone tore their ACL, oh, put them in a cast, 3 months, bye-bye. And we thought that the best thing to do was just put them in a cast, no mobility, no stress, no weight bearing, nothing. But what we've learned is that extending that period of immobility actually has more negative effects because the muscles become so weak, they become atrophied, you're not doing anything to improve blood flow. So now if you have an ACL reconstructive surgery, you don't even get a cast, you get a brace, and maybe you're non-weight bearing, you're on crutches for 5-7 days. Then after that, you're wearing a brace and you're partial weight bearing because we're learning that applying a little bit of stress or moving the areas around it safely promotes blood flow, reduces muscle loss, and actually helps healing. All right, there's some other things that can happen. You don't have to worry about osteomalacia or rickets. This is just some extra information. I would like to talk a little bit about osteoporosis. You probably know what this is. Osteoporosis is when we have a weakened bone tissue. So instead of, this is healthy spongy bone. So we know spongy bone is going to have some spaces in between it, but it should be robust where the bones are. This would be osteoporotic spongy bone. So over time, and this happens with age anyway, like I said before, over time, we're not able to rebuild bone as quickly as we broke it down. So our osteoclasts are still breaking down old tissue, but we're not able to replace it as well. Much more likely to happen in older women, much more likely to happen in spongy bone first in certain areas like the vertebral column. One way to help limit this or help prevent it to a certain extent or delay it is to do weight bearing. So if you ever go to the gym and you see the little old ladies lifting their 3-pound weights and you think, well, what good is that? Well, for older individuals, weight bearing is really important. We need to apply a little bit of stress to our bones to encourage them to remodel. I do a lot of cycling, and if you look at professional cyclists, which is obviously not me, but if you look at professional cyclists, they're training 30, 40 hours a week sitting on their butt. So they're not weight bearing. Even though they're working very hard in terms of their muscles, it's not weight bearing. So one long-term problem of cyclists is that they have very low bone density, more likely to get osteoporosis. So a good cycling coach, even if it's for a professional, in the off season will have them lift some weights because we need to stimulate the bones to regenerate. All right. That's extra. You don't need to know it. This is a review of cartilage. We already talked about it. I just want to ring your memory bell. So we talked about hyaline cartilage. We talked about hyaline cartilage being found connecting the ribs to the sternum. Another place we find hyaline cartilage is at the ends of long bones. Hyaline cartilage in this location can also be called articular cartilage because it's cartilage that's found at an articulation. An articulation just means where two bones meet. So hyaline cartilage at the end of a long bone is sometimes also known as articular cartilage, same thing. But this lining of hyaline cartilage at the end of long bones is a remnant of endochondral ossification, and it also provides a little bit of cushioning. We know what these are already. The end here is just all extra. I got a little carried away one year. But that's it. That's going to finish our skeletal tissue. Next chapter is going to be the bones themselves, and I will see you then.